The crowd gathered thick around the harbor that morning, drawn by the promise of witnessing justice served to the most feared pirate captain in the Caribbean. Captain Blackwood hung shackled to his own mast, his weathered face showing no fear, as townsfolk hurled insults and rotten fruit. The executioner sharpened his blade while children pointed and laughed at the fallen terror of the seas. But perched high in the rigging, unnoticed by the jeering masses, sat Pepper, a small brown monkey whose loyal heart burned with desperate purpose. As the crowd's mockery reached its peak, the clever creature began its descent, tiny paws clutching a set of stolen keys. What happened in the next 60 seconds would transform laughter into gasps of disbelief. Could one small monkey really outsmart an entire port full of soldiers and citizens? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days earlier, the sun had set crimson over Port Royal when Captain Marcus Blackwood made his fatal mistake. He trusted the wrong man. The golden compass that had guided him safely through countless storms now sat locked away in Governor Harrington's vault, confiscated as evidence of his crimes against the crown. That compass had belonged to his grandfather and his grandfather's father before him. Each generation of Blackwood men had used its steady needle to navigate both calm seas and treacherous waters. Now it served as nothing more than a trophy for colonial justice. Vicente Morales, his first mate for 7 years, had played his part perfectly. The man who had stood beside Blackwood through battles with Spanish galleons and British warships had sold him out for 1,000 pieces of silver and a promise of amnesty. When the trap was sprung in the narrow alley behind the Drunken Parrot Tavern, Vicente had been conspicuously absent. The ambush. "You fought like a man possessed," Governor Harrington had told him during the interrogation. "Took 8 soldiers to bring you down, and you still managed to wound 3 of them before they got those shackles on you." Blackwood had said nothing. What was there to say? He had walked into Vicente's trap like a lamb to slaughter, his attention focused on the supposed meeting with a merchant willing to fence their latest prize, a chest of Spanish doubloons taken from a treasure galleon bound for Cadiz. The irony wasn't lost on him. For 15 years, he had terrorized shipping lanes from Tortuga to Barbados. His black flag with its distinctive skull and crossed cutlasses had sent merchant captains scrambling to surrender their cargo rather than face his guns. The mere mention of his name could clear a tavern or send rival pirates seeking safer waters. Yet here he was, brought low not by superior firepower or brilliant naval strategy, but by the oldest weapon in human history, betrayal. Pepper had been there that night, perched on his shoulder as always. The little monkey had sensed the trap before Blackwood himself realized the danger. As they approached the tavern's rear entrance, Pepper had begun chattering nervously, tugging at his coat and pointing toward the shadows where soldiers waited in ambush. But Blackwood, weary from weeks at sea and eager to conclude their business, had ignored his small companion's warnings. When the soldiers emerged from their hiding places with muskets raised and sabers drawn, Pepper had leaped into the darkness, avoiding capture through pure instinct and loyalty. For 3 days now, the monkey had maintained a vigil near the harbor, sleeping in the rigging of Blackwood's captured ship and surviving on scraps stolen from market stalls. The crew had been scattered, some killed in the fight, others imprisoned, a few lucky enough to escape into Port Royal's maze of back streets and hideouts. The port authorities had made a spectacle of Blackwood's capture, parading him through the streets in chains while townspeople jeered and threw refuse. Children who had once cowered at bedtime stories of the terrible pirate captain now danced around his prison cart, emboldened by seeing their boogeyman reduced to mere mortality. Governor Harrington had personally overseen the construction of the execution platform, positioning it directly in front of Blackwood's own ship for maximum symbolic impact. The message was clear: this is what happens to those who challenge British authority in these waters. Make it memorable, Harrington had instructed the executioner, a hooded giant of a man imported from Jamaica specifically for this occasion. I want every pirate from here to Nassau to understand that their days of freedom are numbered. The ceremonial blade had been blessed by the port's chaplain and inscribed with scripture about divine justice. Its edge gleamed in the morning sun as the executioner tested its weight and balance. This would not be a quick, merciful death. It would be theater, designed to entertain the masses and terrify anyone else considering a life of piracy. But Pepper had spent those 3 days doing more than simply mourning his captain's fate. The clever little creature had been studying the harbor's routines, learning the patterns of guards and officials, identifying weaknesses in what appeared to be an impregnable security arrangement. As Blackwood hung in his shackles, weathered hands bound behind his back, and legs barely supporting his weight, he caught sight of movement in the rigging above. A small brown form moved with purpose through the maze of ropes and canvas, invisible to the crowd below but clearly visible to eyes that knew where to look. His heart, which had grown cold with the certainty of death, suddenly flickered with something he hadn't felt since Vicente's betrayal: hope. Pepper's tiny leather collar bore a single letter, P, carved with loving care by hands that would never hold another tool. The collar had been a gift from Emma Blackwood, Marcus's daughter, before the fever took her 8 years ago. She had been only 12 then, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's gentle spirit, and she had insisted that every member of the crew deserved proper identification. "Even Pepper needs to know he belongs somewhere, Papa," she had said, working the soft leather with a sailor's needle borrowed from the ship's cook. The collar was far too elaborate for a simple monkey's accessory. Emma had spent weeks on it, decorating the edges with tiny shells and polishing the brass buckle until it gleamed like gold. Blackwood had found Pepper during a storm off the coast of Honduras, clinging to debris from a Spanish merchant vessel that had broken apart on the reefs. The monkey couldn't have been more than a few months old, soaked and terrified, chattering pitifully as waves crashed over the wreckage. Most captains would have sailed past such a scene, but Emma had been aboard that voyage, one of her rare trips to sea, and she had begged her father to attempt a rescue. "He's just a baby, Papa. Look how scared he is." The rescue had been treacherous. The storm was worsening, and approaching the reef meant risking his entire ship and crew. But Blackwood had learned long ago that saying no to his daughter was harder than facing down a Spanish frigate. They had lowered a boat, and Blackwood himself had rowed through the churning waters to pluck the small creature from certain death. Emma had nursed Pepper back to health with the dedication of a born healer. She fed him milk from a tiny bottle, kept him warm against her chest during cold nights, and taught him the basic signs and commands that would keep him safe aboard a pirate vessel. Under her gentle care, the monkey had grown from a terrified infant into a clever, loyal companion. But it was after Emma's death that Pepper truly became extraordinary. Grief had transformed both monkey and captain, binding them together in a way that transcended the normal relationship between pet and owner. Blackwood had withdrawn into himself, becoming harder and more ruthless in his raids, while Pepper had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense his captain's moods and needs. The monkey had learned to read weather patterns by watching Blackwood study the sky. He could identify enemy sails on the horizon before the lookouts spotted them, his keen eyes picking up details that human vision missed. During battles, Pepper served as an additional pair of hands, carrying messages between decks, retrieving dropped weapons, and even operating simple rigging when the crew was short-handed. More importantly, Pepper had become Blackwood's conscience, the living reminder of Emma's gentle influence on a man who might otherwise have lost himself entirely to the brutal necessities of pirate life. When Blackwood's anger threatened to boil over into unnecessary cruelty, Pepper's presence served as a check on his darker impulses. Monkey seemed to understand that he carried Emma's memory in his small form, and he took that responsibility serious. The crew had initially been skeptical of having a monkey aboard. Sailors were superstitious about animals, and some considered them bad luck, but Pepper had won them over through countless small acts of loyalty and intelligence. He had saved the cook from a galley fire by alerting the crew to smoke they hadn't yet noticed. He had located a leak in the ship's hull by persistently chattering and pointing at a section of planking that appeared sound but was actually compromised. During their last successful raid, the Spanish treasure galleon that had ultimately led to their downfall, Pepper had been instrumental in the victory. While the crew engaged in the traditional sword and pistol combat on deck, the monkey had slipped below to open the ship's sea valves, forcing the Spanish captain to surrender quickly before his vessel sank beneath them. "That monkey's worth 10 men," old Tom the gunner had declared after that battle, and the rest of the crew had heartily agreed. Now, 3 days after the ambush, Pepper wore Emma's collar as both identification and armor against despair. Every time he touched the worn leather, he seemed to draw strength from the memory of the girl who had first shown him kindness. Her spirit lived on in his fierce loyalty to her father, and that loyalty had sustained him through 72 hours of careful planning and preparation. From his perch in the rigging, Pepper could see everything: the crowd's mood, the positions of the guards, the ceremonial preparations that would soon claim his captain's life. But he could also see something the humans below had missed: the subtle signals from crew members who had avoided capture, the strategic placement of allies throughout the crowd, the small details that might yet turn this day of execution into something else entirely. The iron shackles that bound Captain Blackwood to his mast had been forged in the naval yards of Kingston specifically for this occasion. Each link was twice the thickness of standard prisoner restraints, and the blacksmith had been instructed to make them escape-proof. Governor Harrington had personally inspected the metalwork, running his fingers along the heavy chains and testing each connection point. "I want no possibility of failure," he had told the port's chief of security. "This man has escaped from 3 different prisons in his career. We will not give him a 4th opportunity." The security arrangements reflected the governor's paranoia. 50 soldiers surrounded the execution platform in concentric circles, their muskets loaded and bayonets fixed. Additional sharpshooters had been positioned on nearby rooftops, their rifles trained on both the platform and the crowd below. Harbor patrol boats circled the anchored ships, preventing any approach by sea. Governor Harrington himself had arrived an hour before dawn to oversee the final preparations. A tall, thin man with sharp features and ambitious eyes, he saw Blackwood's execution as the capstone of his colonial career. Word of the capture had already reached London, and favorable reports could mean promotion to a more prestigious posting. "The crowds are larger than expected," reported Captain Mills, the port's military commander. "We've counted nearly 800 people so far, and more arriving every hour." Harrington nodded with satisfaction. The larger the audience, the greater the impact of today's lesson in British justice. Street vendors had set up stalls selling meat pies and ale, treating the execution like a festival. Children ran between the adults, playing games and collecting souvenirs, bits of rope, old nails, anything connected to the famous pirate's downfall. The executioner had arrived before sunrise, a massive man whose face remained hidden behind a black hood. He spoke to no one, communicating only through nods and gestures as he inspected his equipment and tested the platform's construction. The ceremonial blade he carried was a work of art, its steel polished to mirror brightness, its handle wrapped in black leather and inscribed with religious verses about divine retribution. "The condemned man has refused last rites," reported Father Ente, the port's chaplain. "He claims no faith in our God and shows no remorse for his crimes." This defiance only added to Blackwood's mystique among the crowd. Even facing death, the pirate captain maintained his reputation for fearless arrogance. Some in the crowd admired this stubborn courage, while others saw it as proof of his irredeemable evil. Behind the scenes, the port's bureaucracy worked frantically to ensure everything proceeded according to protocol. Legal documents had to be filed, death certificates prepared in advance, and arrangements made for disposal of the body. The governor had decided that Blackwood's corpse would be displayed in chains at Gallows Point as a warning to other pirates, a grisly advertisement for the consequences of challenging British authority. Unknown to the officials, their elaborate security measures contained several critical flaws. The focus on preventing external rescue attempts had left gaps in their coverage of the execution site itself. The massive crowd provided cover for movement, and the ceremonial nature of the event had introduced timing vulnerabilities that a clever adversary might exploit. Among the soldiers, tension ran high. Many had heard stories of Blackwood's supernatural luck and uncanny ability to escape impossible situations. Sergeant Davies, a 20-year veteran of colonial service, had positioned his men with particular care. "This one's different from the usual pirates," he warned his soldiers. "He's clever, and he's got friends. Keep your eyes open for anything unusual." The warning proved prophetic, though not in the way Davies expected. Several of his own men were former merchant sailors who had served under Captains Blackwood had captured and released unharmed. Pirate raids were business, not personal vendettas, and Blackwood's reputation for treating prisoners well had earned him unexpected sympathy among Port Royal's maritime community. As the morning progressed, the crowd's mood shifted from anticipation to impatience. The ceremony was taking longer than expected, and the tropical sun was growing uncomfortably hot. Children grew restless, and adults began calling for action. The delay worked in favor of anyone planning disruption. Attention spans were shortening, and discipline among both crowd and guards was beginning to relax. High above the scene, invisible to the security forces below, Pepper continued his patient surveillance. The monkey had identified the key weaknesses in the human arrangements, the blind spots in their coverage, the timing of guard rotations, the psychological pressure points where chaos might be introduced most effectively. The iron shackles that were meant to guarantee Blackwood's death would soon become the first domino in an elaborate chain of events that no one in Port Royal could have anticipated. The torn piece of black cloth fluttered from a lamppost near the harbour market, barely noticeable among the colourful banners and merchant signs. To most passers-by it appeared to be nothing more than a scrap of fabric caught by the wind. But to those who knew how to read such signs, the fragment of Jolly Roger represented hope in the darkest hour. Tommy the Rat Sullivan had placed it there at dawn, following protocols Blackwood had established years earlier for emergency situations. At 15, Tommy was small for his age, with quick hands and quicker feet that had served him well as the ship's cabin boy. When the ambush scattered the crew, he had melted into Port Royal's maze of alleys and shanties, using skills learned on the streets before joining Blackwood's crew. The signal meant that loyal crew members were still free, still organized, and still planning. Throughout the crowd gathering for the execution, familiar faces moved with careful purpose. They had spent 3 days preparing for this moment, knowing that their captain's life hung in the balance. Maria Santos adjusted her shawl and moved through the crowd with practiced ease. As keeper of the Salty Dog Tavern, she knew every sailor, merchant and scoundrel who passed through Port Royal. Her establishment had served as neutral ground for pirates and privateers for 20 years, and her debts to Blackwood ran deeper than money. 2 years earlier, when Spanish raiders had threatened to burn her tavern and kill her customers, Blackwood had intervened without being asked. He had driven off the attackers and refused any payment beyond a bottle of her finest rum. A lady should not have to pay for a gentleman's protection, he had said with that courtly manner that made him so different from other pirates. Now Maria carried a canvas bag filled with what appeared to be laundry but actually contained weapons, tools, and supplies that would be distributed to crew members at precisely the right moment. Her position near the platform's eastern edge gave her clear sightlines to both the execution site and the harbour beyond. Old Pete McKinnon leaned heavily on his walking stick, playing the part of a harmless retired sailor drawn by curiosity. Witness the famous pirate's end. In reality, Pete was anything but harmless. 20 years of service in the Royal Navy had taught him every trick of maritime warfare, and a chance encounter with Blackwood during a Spanish attack had shown him the difference between a butcher and a professional. Pete's debt was one of blood and honor. When fever had struck his crew during a trading voyage to Cartagena, Blackwood could have easily taken their cargo and left them to die. Instead, the pirate captain had shared his ship's medical supplies and provided safe escort to the nearest friendly port. Pete's grandson lived today because of Blackwood's unexpected mercy. The old sailor's position near the guard station was no accident. His decades of military experience had taught him to read the subtle signs of unit cohesion and readiness. He could see that the soldiers were nervous, uncertain, and focused too heavily on external threats, while ignoring internal vulnerabilities. Scattered throughout the crowd, 8 other crew members maintained their cover while watching for Tommy's signal. Each had specific assignments, developed through careful reconnaissance and planning. Some would create diversions, others would provide escape routes, and a few would engage in direct action when the moment came. The plan was ambitious and dangerous, with multiple contingencies built into every phase. Success depended on precise timing, coordinated action, and the hope that their enemies would underestimate both their determination and their capabilities. Most importantly, it relied on Pepper's ability to initiate the sequence at exactly the right moment. From his position in the rigging, the monkey had clear sight of the torn flag and the positioned crew members. His intelligence allowed him to understand not just the immediate tactical situation, but the emotional stakes involved. These people weren't just following orders or fulfilling obligations, they were risking their lives for a captain who had earned their loyalty through years of fair treatment and mutual respect. The fragment of Jolly Roger represented more than just a signal or a plan. It embodied the pirate code that Blackwood had lived by: loyalty to crew, protection of the weak, and defiance of unjust authority. That code had bound his followers together through countless dangers, and it would bind them together now in the most desperate gamble of their life. As the morning progressed and the crowd grew larger, the hidden network of allies tightened their positions and prepared for action. The execution that Governor Harrington intended as a demonstration of British power was about to become something entirely different, a testament to the bonds that form between people who face danger together and refuse to abandon their own. Governor Harrington's ceremonial staff gleamed in the morning sunlight, its polished mahogany shaft topped with the royal coat of arms wrought in silver and gold. The staff had been presented to him by the Colonial Office upon his appointment to Port Royal, and he carried it now as both symbol of authority and personal talisman. Today would mark the pinnacle of his career in service to the Crown. Citizens of Port Royal, his voice boomed across the harbour as he raised the staff high above his head. We gather this morning to witness justice served upon one who has terrorized our shipping lanes and threatened the peace of our waters. The crowd pressed closer to the platform, drawn by the pageantry and the promise of spectacle. Harrington had orchestrated every detail of the ceremony with theatrical precision. Military drummers provided a steady rhythm that built tension, while the port's official herald read a lengthy catalogue of Blackwood's alleged crimes. Marcus Blackwood stands accused of piracy upon the high seas, theft of Her Majesty's property, assault upon peaceful merchants, and conspiracy against the lawful government of these islands, the herald proclaimed. For these crimes, he has been sentenced to death by public execution. Phil is this. Father Mackenzie stepped forward with his prayer book, offering final words of spiritual comfort that Blackwood pointedly ignored. The captain's silence only enhanced his mystique among the watching crowd. Even facing death, he maintained the proud bearing that had made him a legend throughout the Caribbean. The executioner tested his blade one final time, running a cloth along its edge, while the crowd held its collective breath. The ceremony had been timed to coincide with the morning tide, ensuring maximum attendance and symbolic weight. Governor Harrington believed deeply in the power of public ritual to reinforce social orders. Let this serve as warning to any who would challenge British authority in these waters. Harrington continued, his voice carrying clearly across the harbour. The Crown's justice is swift, certain, and absolute. Unknown to the governor, his emphasis on ceremony and spectacle had created exactly the conditions that would facilitate rescue. The formal nature of the proceedings required precise timing and choreographed movements that could be predicted and exploited. The large crowd provided cover for coordinated action, while the focus on pageantry diverted attention from practical security concerns. Captain Mills shifted nervously beside the platform, his military instincts warning him that something felt wrong about the morning's atmosphere. The crowd was too quiet, too attentive. Experienced soldiers learned to recognize the subtle signs that preceded violence, and several of those signs were present today. "Sir," he whispered to the governor during a pause in the proceedings, "perhaps we should accelerate the timeline. The men are reporting unusual activity among the spectators." Harrington dismissed the concern with an impatient wave of his ceremonial staff. This was his moment of triumph, and he would not have it spoiled by military paranoia. The ceremony would proceed according to his carefully planned schedule, with full pomp and proper dignity. High in the rigging above, Pepper watched the governor's performance with the focused attention of a predator studying its prey. The monkey had learned to read human behavior through years of observing both allies and enemies, and he could see the arrogance and self-satisfaction that made Harrington vulnerable to surprise. The ceremonial staff represented everything that Blackwood and his crew opposed: the rigid hierarchy of colonial authority, the assumption that power came from position rather than merit, the belief that common people existed only to serve their betters. In contrast, pirate society operated on principles of earned respect and shared danger, where leadership came from competence rather than appointment. As the governor continued his speech about law and order, Pepper began his careful descent through the rigging. Each movement was calculated to avoid detection while positioning him for maximum effectiveness when the moment came. The ceremony's formal structure provided perfect turf for his preparations. The crowd's attention remained fixed on Harrington's performance, exactly as the governor intended. Parents lifted children to their shoulders for better views. Merchants hawked souvenirs, and soldiers maintained their rigid formations. No one noticed the small brown figure moving with purpose through the maze of ropes and canvas above their heads. "The sentence will now be carried out," Harrington declared, raising his staff once more in a gesture of final authority. "Let justice be done in the sight of God and in service to His Majesty's government." The executioner stepped forward, his hooded face turning toward Blackwood as he raised the ceremonial blade. The crowd fell silent, sensing that the moment of climax had finally arrived. The jailer's ring of keys jingled softly at his belt as he shifted his weight, trying to get a better view of the governor's speech. Sergeant Willis had been assigned to guard duty rather than ceremonial participation, a fact that rankled his pride, but would soon prove providential for the condemned pirate captain. The keys he carried were more than simple tools. They represented access, freedom, and the thin line between life and death. Pepper's descent from the rigging required every skill he had learned during years of acrobatic movement aboard ship. The monkey used the natural rhythm of the ceremony to mask his approach, timing each movement to coincide with applause or verbal responses from the crowd. His small size and brown coloring made him nearly invisible against the weathered wood and hemp rope of the ship's rigging. The first challenge was reaching the platform without being spotted by the circle of guards. Pepper solved this by following a route that took him behind the executioner's position, using the massive man's bulk to shield his approach from the soldiers' sightlines. Years of shipboard life had taught him to read human attention patterns and exploit their natural blind spots. Sergeant Willis stood with his back to the mast, his attention focused on Governor Harrington's theatrical performance. The keys hung from a leather cord attached to his belt, positioned perfectly for a small, quick hand to access without detection. Pepper had studied the sergeant's habits during the 3 days of preparation, learning his routines and identifying the moments when his vigilance relaxed. As Harrington's voice rose to emphasize a particularly dramatic point about British justice, Pepper made his move. The monkey dropped silently from the rigging onto the platform's edge, then scurried along the wooden planking with movements so fluid they seemed like tricks of light and shadow. The crowd's focus remained fixed on the governor's speech, exactly as the rescue plan required. The actual theft required less than 3 seconds. Pepper's nimble fingers worked the leather cord loose from Willis's belt, while the sergeant applauded his governor's rhetoric. The ring of keys slipped free without the slightest sound, disappearing into Pepper's grasp like a magic trick performed by an invisible conjurer. But possession of the keys was only the beginning of the challenge. Blackwood's shackles were positioned behind his body, requiring Pepper to approach from the captain's blind side while remaining undetected by both guards and spectators. The monkey solved this problem by climbing up the mast itself, using the execution apparatus as cover for his approach to the lock mechanism. The crowd's laughter provided perfect acoustic cover as Pepper began testing keys in the heavy iron lock. His small hands could manipulate the mechanism more easily than human fingers, and his patience had been honed by years of solving mechanical puzzles aboard ship. Each failed attempt taught him more about the lock's internal structure, bringing him closer to finding the correct key. Captain Blackwood felt the subtle vibrations in his restraints as Pepper worked, but his expression never changed. Years of command had taught him to control his reactions, even in the most desperate circumstances. He continued to stare defiantly at his executioners, while his loyal companion worked frantically behind him. The third key clicked smoothly into the lock mechanism. Pepper's sensitive fingers felt the internal tumblers align, and he began the careful process of turning the key without creating noise that might alert the guards. The lock was well oiled and properly maintained, ironic, since its excellent condition now worked against its intended purpose. Sergeant Willis finally noticed the missing keys when he reached for them during a routine security check. His confused expression quickly transformed into alarm as he realized the implications of their disappearance. But the ceremony's formal structure prevented him from raising an immediate alarm. Interrupting the governor's speech would be a career-ending breach of protocol. Instead, Willis began a subtle search of the platform area, trying to locate his missing keys without disrupting the proceedings. His movements caught the attention of other guards, who began their own careful surveillance of the immediate area. The security perimeter that had seemed so impregnable was beginning to develop cracks. High above, Pepper felt the lock mechanism give way with a satisfying click. The first shackle opened smoothly, freeing Blackwood's left hand. The captain's fingers flexed as circulation returned, but he maintained his stoic pose while Pepper moved to the second lock. Freedom was only moments away, but those moments would determine whether the rescue succeeded or ended in disaster for both captain and monkey. The crowd continued watching Harrington's performance, unaware that the morning's entertainment was about to take a dramatic and unexpected turn. The barrel of gunpowder sat innocuously among the ship's supplies, marked with the standard warning symbols that all sailors recognized and respected. None of the port authorities had thought to remove the explosive materials from Blackwood's captured vessel, an oversight that would prove catastrophic for their carefully planned execution. The black powder within that wooden container held enough force to change the entire morning's trajectory. Tommy Sullivan had positioned himself near the ship's supply area, with practiced nonchalance, appearing to be nothing more than a curious street urchin drawn by the spectacle. His years as cabin boy had taught him the location of every dangerous item aboard any sailing vessel, and he had spent the previous evening carefully planning how to create maximum chaos with minimum personal risk. As Pepper worked frantically to free the second shackle, Tommy struck a flint and touched it to a trail of powder he had carefully laid while the guard's attention focused on the ceremonial proceedings. The powder line snaked from his position across 30 feet of deck planking, leading directly to the supply barrel that would serve as the centerpiece of their diversion. The spark traveled along the powder trail with malicious purpose, hissing and crackling as it consumed the carefully prepared fuse. Tommy had calculated the timing to give himself opportunity for escape while ensuring the explosion would occur at precisely the moment when Blackwood needed maximum distraction from his captors. Maria Santos saw the telltale spark and immediately began her own contribution to the planned chaos. From her canvas bag, she produced a collection of glass bottles filled with lamp oil and began hurling them at strategic locations around the platform. The bottles shattered against wooden posts and stone foundations, spreading slippery hazards that would complicate any pursuit while filling the air with additional confusion. Old Pete McKinnon tapped his walking stick against a support beam in a rhythmic pattern that signaled the other hidden crew members to begin their coordinated disruption. Within seconds, apparent spectators throughout the crowd began implementing their assigned tasks. Some started fights with nearby soldiers, others released chickens and pigs stolen from the market, and several began shouting contradictory orders in voices trained to carry across storm-tossed decks. The gunpowder barrel exploded with a thunderous roar that shook every building in the harbor district. The blast sent wooden debris flying in all directions, created a massive cloud of smoke that obscured visibility across half the platform area, and produced a sound so loud that several horses broke free from their hitching posts and began stampeding through the crowd. Governor Harrington stumbled backward as the explosion's shockwave knocked him off balance, his ceremonial staff clattering across the wooden planking. The carefully orchestrated dignity of his execution ceremony dissolved instantly into pandemonium as smoke, noise, and flying debris transformed the organized gathering into a scene of utter chaos. Captain Mills shouted orders to his soldiers, but his voice was lost in the cacophony of screaming spectators, neighing horses, and the crackling flames that had erupted from the ship's damaged supply area. The military formation that had seemed so impregnable moments earlier began breaking apart as individual soldiers reacted to immediate threats rather than following coordinated commands. Pepper used the explosion's cover to complete his work on Blackwood's restraint. The second shackle clicked open just as the shockwave reached the platform, and the captain's hands were suddenly free for the first time in 3 days. Years of combat experience allowed Blackwood to maintain his balance despite the chaos erupting around him, and his mind immediately began calculating escape routes and tactical opportunities. The executioner, thrown off balance by the unexpected blast, stumbled and dropped his ceremonial blade. The weapon that had been intended to end Blackwood's life now lay abandoned on the platform, while its wielder struggled to regain his footing in the swirling smoke and confusion. Sergeant Willis, still searching frantically for his missing keys, found himself knocked to his knees by a piece of flying debris from the exploded barrel. His uniform was singed and his hearing temporarily damaged, leaving him disoriented and unable to effectively coordinate the security response that the situation desperately required. Throughout the crowd, the hidden crew members continued their campaign of strategic disruption. Release more animals, overturn vendor stalls, start additional small fires, and generally ensure that the organized execution became an uncontrollable riot. Each action was calculated to increase confusion while providing cover for their captain's escape. The barrel that had contained enough gunpowder to sink a small ship had instead served to liberate the most notorious pirate in the Caribbean, proving once again that the most dangerous weapon in any arsenal is often the one your enemies don't expect you to use. Blackwood's hands flexed with the sweet sensation of restored circulation, weathered fingers working out the stiffness from 3 days of iron restraint. The moment his shackles fell away, every instinct honed by decades of combat and command surged back to life. These hands had wielded cutlass and pistol through countless battles, had navigated by star and compass across endless seas, and had earned the respect of crews who followed him into the teeth of hurricanes and enemy fire. The chaos surrounding the platform provided perfect cover as Blackwood assessed his tactical situation with the cold precision that had made him legendary. Smoke from the gunpowder explosion obscured vision beyond 20 feet. Panicked spectators provided human shields against musket fire, and the guards' broken formation offered multiple escape routes for a man who understood battlefield dynamics. His first priority was retrieving weapons. The ceremonial table where his confiscated belongings had been displayed sat only 10 feet away, temporarily abandoned, as officials struggled to restore order. Blackwood moved through the smoke with the fluid grace of a man born to violence, his bare feet silent against the wooden planking, despite the chaos erupting around him. The familiar weight of his cutlass felt like greeting an old friend as his fingers closed around the leather-wrapped hilt. The blade had been forged in Toledo steel by Spanish masters, its edge honed to razor sharpness through years of careful maintenance. More than a weapon, it was an extension of his will, a tool that had carved his reputation across the Caribbean's bloody waters. His pistol occupied the holster that had ridden his hip through 100 battles. The weapon was French-made, its firing mechanism more reliable than British equivalents, its balance perfect for both accuracy and quick draw. Blackwood checked the priming powder with practiced efficiency, ensuring the weapon would fire when needed, despite 3 days of neglect. A British soldier emerged from the smoke, bayonet extended in a clumsy charge that betrayed his inexperience with close-quarters combat. Blackwood sidestepped the thrust with minimal effort, his cutlass describing a precise arc that opened the man's sleeve without breaking skin. The soldier stumbled past, carried by his own momentum, into a collision with a fleeing spectator. "Stand down, and you'll live to see another dawn," Blackwood called after the fallen soldier, his voice carrying the authority of command even in chaos. This was not mindless violence, but controlled application of force, the difference between a butcher and a professional. Governor Harrington appeared through the smoke, his ceremonial staff raised like a club in hands that had never known real combat. His face showed the desperation of a man watching his carefully planned triumph dissolve into humiliating disaster. Behind him, Captain Mills struggled to rally soldiers who were scattered and demoralized by the explosion's aftermath. "You will not escape British justice," Harrington shouted, swinging his staff in a wild arc that Blackwood easily avoided. "British justice?" Blackwood's laugh cut through the surrounding chaos. "You mean British theater? There's a difference, Governor, though you've learned it." The pirate captain's riposte sent Harrington's staff spinning from nerveless fingers. A precise kick to the back of the governor's knee sent the man sprawling onto the blood-stained platform where he had intended to watch Blackwood die. The symbolic reversal was complete. The representative of imperial authority lay helpless while the condemned pirate stood free and armed. Pepper appeared at Blackwood's shoulder, chattering excitedly and pointing toward the harbor, where loyal crew members were already implementing the next phase of their escape plan. The monkey's brown eyes sparkled with intelligence and satisfaction at the success of his daring rescue mission. "Well done, my friend," Blackwood murmured, extending his arm so Pepper could assume his traditional position, "though I suspect our real challenges are just beginning." Captain Mills had managed to gather a dozen soldiers into a rough formation, their muskets aimed, despite the poor visibility and civilian obstacles. The military commander's face showed grim determination as he prepared to salvage what remained of the port's reputation for security and control. Around the platform, fires burned from overturned lamp stalls, animals wandered loose through the crowd, and the organized execution had become a riot that would be remembered throughout the Caribbean. Blackwood's reputation, already legendary, would grow with each retelling of this morning's events. The captain's freed hands gripped his weapons with renewed purpose as he prepared for the fighting retreat that would carry him from this platform to his ship, and from captivity to the open sea beyond. The ship's brass bell hung silent in the chaos, waiting for the signal that would transform scattered resistance into coordinated retreat. Cast in foundries of Bristol 30 years earlier, the bell had called Blackwood's crew to action through storms and battles across 2 decades of piracy. Its voice could cut through cannon fire and hurricane winds, carrying commands that meant the difference between victory and death. Combat erupted across the harbor in a dozen simultaneous confrontations as Blackwood's hidden allies revealed themselves to British forces who had believed themselves in complete control. The carefully planned diversions had successfully fragmented the military response, turning what should have been overwhelming superiority into a series of isolated skirmishes. Tommy Sullivan engaged 2 soldiers near the supply wagons, his youth and speed compensating for their advantages in size and training. The boy had learned knife fighting in Port Royal's back alleys before joining Blackwood's crew, and those brutal lessons served him well now. He ducked a bayonet thrust and opened a soldier's wrist with a precise cut that disabled without killing. Maria Santos fought with the fierce determination of a woman protecting her life's work. Her tavern had been sanctuary for sailors of every nation, and the connections forged over decades of hospitality now paid dividends in loyalty and support. 3 former customers formed a protective circle around her as she coordinated the distribution of weapons to crew members throughout the crowd. Old Pete McKinnon proved that age had not dulled his military instincts. The walking stick that made him appear frail concealed a steel blade, and his apparent weakness masked reflexes honed by 20 years of naval service. A young British lieutenant learned this lesson the hard way when Pete's hidden sword opened his shoulder and sent his pistol spinning into the harbor. The battle's tide turned when David Iron Fist Morrison emerged from his hiding place among the cargo containers. Standing 6 feet 4 inches with arms like tree trunks, Iron Fist had earned his nickname during a legendary tavern brawl in Tortuga, where he had fought 8 men simultaneously and left all of them unconscious. Now he waded into the British formation like a force of nature, his massive fists scattering soldiers and creating gaps in their defensive line. Captain Mills tried desperately to restore order among his scattered forces, but the surprise and chaos had shattered military discipline. Soldiers accustomed to fighting organized enemies found themselves facing opponents who appeared and disappeared like ghosts, striking from unexpected angles before melting back into the crowd of panicked civilians. Blackwood himself carved a path through the melee with the surgical precision of a master swordsman. His cutlass work was poetry written in steel, each cut perfectly placed to disable rather than kill, each parry timed to create openings for allies while minimizing his own exposure. This was not the wild hacking of a desperate fugitive, but the controlled violence of a professional who understood that needless death served no tactical purpose. The governor's ceremonial platform became the focal point of the most intense fighting as British forces attempted to prevent their prize prisoner from reaching his ship. Sergeant Willis, recovered from the explosion's effects, led a determined charge up the platform's steps with a handful of his most reliable men. Blackwood met them at the platform's edge, his blade describing arches of deadly geometry that turned their numerical advantage into liability. In the confined space, only one soldier could engage him at a time, negating their superior numbers while allowing his superior skill to dominate each individual encounter. Pepper proved invaluable during the platform fighting, his small size and agility allowing him to distract enemies at crucial moments. The monkey would appear suddenly to tug at a soldier's coat or knock weapons from nervous hands, creating the split-second opportunities that Blackwood exploited with lethal efficiency. As the battle raged, the brass bell remained silent, waiting for the moment when retreat became tactically sound. Blackwood understood that courage without wisdom led to pointless death, and his years of command had taught him to recognize when boldness must yield to prudence. The harbor echoed with the clash of steel on steel, the crack of pistol fire, and the shouts of men whose careful plans had dissolved into elemental struggle for survival. Smoke from the gunpowder explosion mixed with dust, kicked up by running feet and scattered cargo, creating an atmosphere of surreal chaos that transformed familiar surroundings into an alien battlefield. Through it all, the bell waited in patient silence, ready to signal the next phase of an escape that had already exceeded every participant's wildest expectations for success and spectacle. The military dispatch crackled with official seals and urgent script as Captain Mills frantically scrawled orders for naval pursuit. Written on parchment bearing the royal watermark, the document represented escalating stakes that would transform a local embarrassment into a Caribbean-wide manhunt. Every word carried the weight of imperial authority and personal desperation. To all naval commanders in Jamaica Station, Mills wrote with trembling hand, "The notorious pirate Marcus Blackwood has escaped custody and must be recaptured at any cost. Deploy all available vessels for immediate pursuit. The reputation of British justice depends upon swift resolution of this crisis." Governor Harrington, his clothing torn and dignity shattered, supervised the military response from his hastily established command post near the customs house. Blood from a cut on his forehead stained his white collar, and his ceremonial staff lay broken where Blackwood had contemptuously discarded it. The morning that was to have crowned his career had instead become his professional nightmare. "Signal the HMS Retribution and HMS Defiance," he commanded. "Both ships are to weigh anchor immediately and join the pursuit. I want every gun and every sail we can muster on these waters within the hour." The military response revealed the true scope of British naval power in Caribbean waters. 3 frigates, 2 sloops of war, and a dozen smaller patrol vessels began preparing for immediate departure from ports across Jamaica. Each ship carried enough firepower to reduce Blackwood's vessel to floating splinters, and their combined crews numbered in the hundreds. But mobilizing such force required time, and time was the one commodity that Blackwood's escape plan was designed to exploit. Every minute of delay increased his chances of reaching open water where superior seamanship could compensate for inferior firepower. The dispatch that should have sealed his fate instead highlighted the bureaucratic inefficiency that gave him hope. Lieutenant Ashford, Mills's most reliable subordinate, coordinated the signal flags that carried urgent messages to anchored warships. Each vessel required specific orders, detailed intelligence about the target, and coordination with other pursuing units. The complexity of the operation worked against the speed that success required. "Sir," Ashford reported, "the Retribution requires 30 minutes to complete preparations for sea. The Defiance reports mechanical problems with her anchor windlass that may delay departure by an hour." Mills cursed the peacetime maintenance schedules that left his most powerful ships unprepared for immediate action. In wartime, every vessel would have been ready to sail at a moment's notice. But years of relative calm had bred complacency that now threatened to cost them their most valuable prisoner. The townspeople of Port Royal watched the naval preparations with mixtures of excitement and apprehension. Many had lost friends or family to pirate attacks over the years, and Blackwood's escape revived fears that had seemed safely buried beneath British military superiority. Others secretly admired the audacity of the rescue and wondered if their supposedly invincible protectors were as competent as they claimed. Merchant captains throughout the harbour began securing their cargo and preparing to remain in port until the crisis resolved. The insurance syndicates of London had long memories for pirate attacks, and premiums would increase dramatically if Blackwood returned to active raiding. Economic considerations added urgency to political embarrassment in driving the pursuit effort. The dispatch Mills was writing would eventually reach Admiralty headquarters in London, where it would trigger investigations, recriminations, and policy changes that would reshape Caribbean naval operations for years to come. But those long-term consequences mattered less than the immediate challenge of preventing Blackwood from reaching the open sea. "Include provisions for civilian vessels," Governor Harrington added to the dispatch. "Any merchant captain who aids in Blackwood's capture will receive £1,000 reward. Any captain who aids his escape will face charges of treason." The governor's threats reflected his understanding that Blackwood's network of allies extended far beyond his immediate crew. Smugglers, merchants, and even some colonial officials had profited from the pirates' activities over the years. Turning the entire Caribbean into hostile territory required eliminating every potential source of assistance. As the military machine slowly ground into motion, precious minutes ticked away that could never be recovered. Each signal flag raised, each order written, each preparation completed brought the pursuing forces closer to readiness, while simultaneously allowing their quarry additional time to implement his own escape plans. The dispatch that would carry news of this disaster to the highest levels of British government served as a stark reminder that even the most carefully planned operations could be undone by a single moment of unexpected audacity. The ship's hidden cache lay concealed beneath loose planking in the forward hold, invisible to the British search teams who had confiscated obvious weapons and supplies, but missed this carefully disguised emergency reserve. Inside the waterproof compartment, Blackwood had stored the tools of survival that could mean the difference between escape and recapture: spare weapons, medical supplies, navigation instruments, and gold coins that could purchase assistance or passage in friendly ports. Blackwood reached the cache just as the brass bell finally rang its urgent call to retreat. The sound cut through the harbor's chaos like a sword through silk, its familiar voice rallying scattered crew members and signaling the transition from diversionary fighting to coordinated withdrawal. Every pirate who heard that bell understood that the time for individual heroics had passed. Now survival depended on reaching their ship before British naval forces could organize an effective pursuit. Tommy Sullivan was the first to reach the vessel, his youth and desperation driving him through a gauntlet of soldiers and panicked civilians. Blood from a bayonet graze streaked his left arm, but his knife hand remained steady as he cut down two Marines who tried block his path to the gangplank. The boy's street-fighting instincts served him well in the running battle that carried him from dock to deck. Maria Santos followed close behind, her canvas bag now empty but her determination undiminished. 3 of her tavern's regular customers had formed an escort, their loyalty to the woman who had provided sanctuary and friendship over the years, expressed through acts of violence that would have shocked their families. They fought with the desperate courage of men, protecting something precious. Old Pete McKinnon moved with surprising speed for his apparent age and infirmity. The walking stick that had concealed a blade now served as a genuine support as he navigated debris-strewn planking while British soldiers closed in from multiple directions. Behind him, Iron Fist Morrison provided a rear guard that discouraged pursuit through the simple expedient of breaking anyone who came too close. The hidden cache yielded treasures that went far beyond material value. Blackwood's spare compass bore inscriptions from his grandfather and father, connecting him to generations of seafaring men. You had faced similar moments of desperate decision. Emergency medical supplies could save crew members' lives during the voyage to safety. Most importantly, the cache contained detailed charts of hidden anchorages and safe harbors throughout the Caribbean, knowledge that could mean the difference between freedom and death. Pepper leaped from the dock to the ship's rail with acrobatic grace, his small hands finding familiar holds in rigging he had climbed countless times before. The monkey's excited chatter carried intelligence about pursuing forces and potential escape routes, information gathered during his reconnaissance missions over the past 3 days. His loyalty had initiated the rescue, and his intelligence would be crucial for its completion. British soldiers reached the dock's edge just as the last crew members gained the ship's deck. Captain Mills led the pursuit personally, his face grim with the knowledge that failure here would end his military career in disgrace. Behind him, 24 Marines prepared to board the pirate vessel and recapture their escaped prisoner through force of arms. "Cut the mooring lines," Blackwood commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect across Caribbean waters for 15 years. "Prepare to make sail on my order." The ship's rigging showed damage from 3 days of British occupation, but the essential lines remained intact. Blackwood's crew worked with desperate efficiency to ready their vessel for departure, knowing that every second of delay increased the chance that overwhelming force would trap them against the dock. From the cache, Blackwood retrieved his father's cutlass, a weapon that had served the family through 3 generations of naval warfare. The blade's steel held the memory of countless battles, and its balance was as familiar as his own heart. More than a tool for fighting, it was a symbol of continuity that connected past to present. The emergency supplies also included a leather pouch containing letters from his daughter Emma, carefully preserved despite years of salt air and combat. These pages represented the only remaining connection to the life he had known before grief and loss had driven him to piracy. Their presence in the cache reminded him that some treasures were worth more than gold or glory. As British forces prepared to storm his ship, Blackwood felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders. The escape from execution had been only the beginning. Now came the true test of seamanship, strategy, and courage that would determine whether this day ended in freedom or death. The Union Jack snapped proudly from the mainmast of HMS Retribution as the British warship emerged from Port Royal's harbour in full pursuit, her 32 guns run out and ready for action. The flag represented the might of an empire that ruled the waves, commanded the seas, and suffered no challenge to its authority. Behind it sailed HMS Defiance and 3 smaller vessels, their combined firepower enough to reduce any pirate ship to floating wreckage within minutes. Captain Reginald Hartwell commanded the Retribution with the confidence of a man who had never lost a naval engagement. His ship was faster, more heavily armed, and manned by professional sailors whose discipline had been forged in battles against French and Spanish fleets. The pursuit of a single pirate vessel should have been a routine exercise in imperial justice. "Signal the squadron to maintain formation," Hartwell commanded his signal officer. "We shall run down this criminal like the dog he is and demonstrate to all that British naval supremacy tolerates no challenge." But Blackwood's ship, the Crimson Tide, had advantages that Hartwell's confidence overlooked. Her hull had been scraped and careened only weeks earlier, removing the barnacles and weed that slowed larger vessels. Her rigging had been optimized for speed rather than firepower, and her crew knew every trick of seamanship that could extract maximum performance from wind and sail. More importantly, Blackwood possessed intimate knowledge of Caribbean waters that no British chart could match. 15 years of raiding had taught him every reef, current and hidden passage between Nassau and Cartagena. The very waters that the Royal Navy considered their domain contained secrets known only to those who had learned them through necessity and desperation. The chase began in earnest as both vessels cleared the harbor's protective headlands and entered the open Caribbean. Morning winds favored the pursuers initially, allowing the heavier British ships to gain ground through their superior sail area. The Retribution's bow wave grew larger as her speed increased, and her gun crews prepared for the moment when their quarry came within effective range. 2 miles and closing, reported the Retribution's sailing master. At this rate, we shall have them under our guns within the hour. Pepper scrambled through the Crimson Tide's rigging with desperate energy, his small hands working to repair damage inflicted during the British occupation. Lines that had been deliberately cut required splicing, and blocks that had been loosened needed retightening. The monkey's intimate knowledge of the ship's rigging made him invaluable for repairs that human sailors couldn't complete quickly enough. Tommy Sullivan worked alongside experienced crew members to optimize their sail configuration for maximum speed. The boy's youth and agility allowed him to reach positions that others couldn't access safely, and his 3 days of enforced idleness had left him eager to prove his worth through action rather than words. "Trim the main topgallant," Blackwood commanded, his eyes constantly shifting between his pursuers and the horizon ahead. "Tighten the weather braces and shift the jib to catch more wind." Each adjustment extracted additional speed from their vessel, but the improvements came at the cost of stability and safety. Pushing any ship beyond its designed limits risked dismasting or structural failure that would end the chase immediately. Blackwood walked the razor's edge between maximum performance and catastrophic breakdown. The British squadron maintained its steady pursuit, professional seamanship evident in their precise formation and coordinated movements. 3 ships in line ahead. Formation presented an intimidating sight, their black-painted hulls and white sails creating an image of inexorable justice that had terrified enemies across the world's oceans. Behind the leading warships, smaller patrol vessels spread across a wider area to prevent Blackwood from escaping through flanking maneuvers. The British had learned from previous encounters with Caribbean pirates, and their tactics reflected careful planning designed to eliminate every possible escape route. "They're gaining on us," reported Elena Vasquez, who had joined the crew during their escape and now served as an additional lookout. Her experience as a nurse had given her steady nerves under pressure, qualities that proved valuable during the stress of pursuit. Blackwood studied the British formation with the calculating eye of a predator assessing dangerous prey. The pursuing ships represented overwhelming firepower, but their size and weight also created vulnerabilities that a smaller, more agile vessel might exploit. The key was reaching the shallow waters, where his knowledge of hidden channels could neutralize their numerical advantage. The Union Jack continued to snap in the morning breeze, its red, white, and blue pattern a stark reminder of the imperial power that would show no mercy to captured pirates. The lightning-split mast towered above the Crimson Tide like a broken finger, pointing accusingly at the storm-darkened sky. What had seemed like certain disaster when the electrical bolt struck their mainmast now appeared as salvation sent by the very gods of the sea. The jagged wood that should have crippled their vessel instead provided perfect camouflage against the tempest that had risen from the Caribbean's depth with supernatural suddenness. Captain Hartwell aboard HMS Retribution watched in frustration as the storm clouds gathered with unnatural speed, transforming a clear morning into a maelstrom that threatened to swallow both hunter and hunted. The British commander had seen Caribbean weather change quickly before, but never with such dramatic timing or devastating effect on his carefully planned pursuit. "All ships reduce sail," Hartwell commanded as the first gusts of wind began tearing at his rigging. "Signal the squadron to maintain visual contact if possible." but visual contact became impossible within minutes, as the storm engulfed both fleets in a chaos of wind, rain, and towering waves. The Retribution's superior size, which had been an advantage in the chase, now became a liability as her massive hull presented more surface area for the hurricane winds to assault. Her crew struggled to reduce sail before the storm could dismast their vessel entirely. Pepper clung to the Crimson Tide's damaged rigging with desperate determination, his small hands working to secure loose lines while hurricane winds tried to tear him from his perch. The monkey's light weight, usually a disadvantage in rough weather, now allowed him to work in positions where heavier crew members would have been blown overboard instantly. The split mast created its own acoustic signature as wind howled through the broken wood, producing an eerie whistle that cut through the storm's general cacophony. This sound became a beacon for scattered crew members who had been temporarily blinded by driving rain and needed auditory reference points to maintain their positions. Blackwood stood at his ship's wheel with the calm authority of a man who had weathered countless storms in these same waters. His hands felt every vibration through the wooden spokes as his vessel rode the mountainous waves, and his inner ear calculated their direction and speed through instincts developed over decades of Caribbean sailing. "Secure the forward hatch," he shouted to Tommy Sullivan, who was working to prevent seawater from flooding their hold. "Check the bilge pumps and report back immediately." The storm's violence threatened to tear their ship apart, but it also provided perfect concealment from British pursuit. Radar and sophisticated tracking systems lay centuries in the future. Naval warfare in 1723 depended entirely on visual contact and dead-reckoning navigation. In conditions where visibility dropped to less than 50 yards, even the most determined pursuit became impossible. Maria Santos and Elena Vasquez worked together in the ship's galley, securing loose equipment and preparing medical supplies for the injuries that storms inevitably produced. Both women had experience with Caribbean weather, and they understood that survival depended on preparation rather than prayers. The lightning that had damaged their mast continued to flash around them, creating a spectacular display of electrical violence that turned the storm into something resembling divine wrath. Each bolt illuminated the towering waves for split seconds before plunging the world back into grey darkness, punctuated only by the phosphorescent foam of breaking seas. Old Pete McKinnon, his walking stick now secured in the ship's hold, worked alongside Iron Fist Morrison to maintain the pumps that kept their vessel afloat. 20 years of naval experience had taught Pete that storms killed more sailors than enemy action, and his knowledge of emergency procedures proved invaluable during the crisis. The British squadron found itself scattered across miles of ocean as individual captains made independent decisions about storm survival. Naval regulations prescribed specific procedures for severe weather, but regulations meant little when hurricane winds threatened to drive ships onto reefs or tear their masts away entirely. Aboard HMS Defiance, Captain Morrison ordered his crew to ride out the storm under bare poles, trusting to his ship's construction and his crew's seamanship to survive whatever the Caribbean could inflict. The decision was sound from a survival standpoint, but meant abandoning any hope of maintaining contact with their quarry. The storm's eye passed over the area near sunset, creating a brief period of supernatural calm that allowed both fleets to assess their damage and position. The Crimson Tide's broken mast had actually improved her stability in heavy weather, while the British ships had suffered varying degrees of damage to rigging and equipment. As night fell and the storm's trailing edge brought renewed but diminishing winds, Blackwood calculated that they had gained at least 6 hours of unchallenged sailing time. The lightning-split mast that had seemed like disaster had instead provided the camouflage and confusion necessary for their escape to succeed. The yellow flag with its black skull and crossbones flew from the harbour tower of Tortuga, signalling safe passage for any vessel flying pirate colours. This welcome flag represented sanctuary among fellow outcasts, a place where questions weren't asked and British authority held no sway. After 18 hours of sailing through treacherous reefs and hidden channels known only to those who lived beyond the law, Blackwood's crew had reached the one port in the Caribbean where their captain's name commanded respect rather than bounties. The Crimson Tide limped into the protected harbor with her split mast, wrapped in canvas, and her crew exhausted from fighting both storm and pursuit. But the sight of that yellow flag lifted spirits that had been strained to breaking during their harrowing escape. Here, surrounded by ships flying the colors of a dozen different pirate captains, they could rest and repair while planning their next moves. Captain Jean-Baptiste Rousseau of the French brigantine Liberté was the first to greet them, rowing out in a longboat filled with rum, fresh water, and medical supplies. The one-eyed Frenchman had been a rival and occasional ally for over a decade, and his presence in Tortuga's harbor represented the informal network of cooperation that bound the pirate brotherhood together. "Mon Dieu, Marcus," Rousseau called, as his boat approached the Crimson Tide's damaged hull. "When we heard of your capture, we thought surely the British had finally caught their prize fish." The reunion carried emotional weight that surprised even Blackwood himself. 3 days of captivity had reminded him how much he valued the loyalty and respect of men who understood the harsh realities of life beyond civilization's boundaries. These pirates might be outcasts and criminals to the world at large, but they represented the closest thing to family that remained in his life. Pepper received an enthusiastic welcome from crews throughout the harbor, word of his daring rescue having spread through the pirate community faster than any official dispatch. Sailors who had known the monkey for years lifted him onto their shoulders and toasted his cleverness with tankards of rum, treating him as the hero of a story that would be told in taverns from Nassau to Port-au-Prince. The repairs to their ship began immediately, with volunteers from other crews lending hands and expertise to restore the Crimson Tide to fighting condition. In the pirate brotherhood, today's rival might be tomorrow's ally, and helping a fellow captain in distress was both practical policy and moral obligation. Tommy Sullivan found himself the center of attention among cabin boys and junior crew members from other ships, all eager to hear first-hand accounts of the rescue and escape. The boy's role in carrying the diversionary explosion had already grown in the telling, and his modest attempts to correct exaggerations only enhanced his reputation for courage and humility. Maria Santos established a temporary tavern in one of Tortuga's abandoned buildings, using supplies donated by grateful captains to create a gathering place where crews could share information and plan future ventures. Her reputation for discretion and fairness made her a natural organizer for the informal council that governed pirate affairs on the island. The yellow flag that welcomed them also served as warning to any British vessels that might attempt pursuit. Tortuga's defenses included shore batteries manned by experienced gunners and a series of signal stations that could alert the entire pirate fleet to approaching danger. Any naval force attempting to enter these waters would face coordinated resistance from ships and shore installations alike. Blackwood met with other captains in the evening, sharing intelligence about British naval movements and discussing the implications of his dramatic escape. The rescue had enhanced his reputation throughout the Caribbean, but it had also increased the bounty on his head and guaranteed that future British responses would be more aggressive and better coordinated. "They will not underestimate us again," warned Captain Isabella Mendoza of the Spanish vessel Venganza. "Your escape has embarrassed them before the entire Caribbean. They will respond with overwhelming force." The strategic implications were clear to everyone present. Blackwood's successful rescue had demonstrated that British authority could be challenged, but it had also provoked a response that would make life more dangerous for every pirate operating in these waters. The yellow flag provided temporary sanctuary, but the broader conflict had only begun. As night fell over Tortuga's harbor, crews from a dozen ships gathered on the beach for an impromptu celebration that honored both Blackwood's escape and Pepper's courage. The monkey sat on his captain's shoulder, while tales of their adventure grew more elaborate, with each telling cementing their place in Caribbean pirate lore. The welcome flag continued to flutter in the evening breeze, its simple design representing complex bonds of loyalty and mutual support that sustained men who had chosen to live free rather than safe. The tavern song sheet bore hastily scrawled lyrics celebrating Pepper's heroic rescue, its ink still wet from the quill of a drunken sailor inspired by the morning's tales. Already the ballad was spreading from ship to ship, carried by voices that had sung sea shanties across every ocean where pirates sailed. The simple paper represented the transformation of recent events into enduring legend, ensuring that the story of a monkey's loyalty would outlive those who witnessed it. "Come gather round, ye sailors bold, and hear a tale of courage true," sang old Calico Pete, his weathered voice carrying across Tortuga's harbor as crews from a dozen ships joined the impromptu chorus. A monkey small with heart so large, who saved his captain through and through. The song's verses grew more elaborate with each telling, transforming Pepper from clever animal into mythic hero, whose exploits defied natural law. In one version, the monkey commanded lightning to strike the British mast. In another, he led an army of harbor rats against the execution platform. Each iteration pushed the boundaries of credibility while capturing emotional truths about loyalty and courage. Word of the escape had spread beyond Tortuga's harbor with supernatural speed, carried by merchant vessels, fishing boats, and message runners who understood the commercial value of spectacular news. In Nassau's pirate strongholds, crew members toasted Pepper's health with rum stolen from British merchants. In Port-au-Prince's taverns, French smugglers composed their own verses celebrating the monkey's triumph over imperial authority. Captain Rousseau contributed his own artistic interpretation, describing Pepper as un singe magnifique, whose intelligence surpassed that of British admirals. The Frenchman's natural flair for drama transformed the rescue into an epic worthy of Homer, complete with divine intervention and supernatural assistance from spirits of the sea. The ballad's popularity reflected deeper currents of resentment against British naval dominance in Caribbean waters. Every sailor who had been pressed into service, every merchant who had lost cargo to imperial taxes, and every colonist who chafed under foreign rule found vicarious satisfaction in the story of a small creature outwitting the empire's representative. In Port Royal itself, the song's circulation created serious problems for Governor Harrington's administration. Tavern keepers reported customers demanding performances of the monkey's rescue, while street musicians earned substantial tips by playing variations on the increasingly popular melody. The very people who had witnessed Blackwood's intended execution now celebrated his escape through musical performance. British authorities attempted to suppress the ballad through threats and arrests, but their heavy-handed response only increased its popularity. Forbidden songs possessed special appeal for populations already suspicious of imperial authority, and the monkey's rescue became a symbol of resistance that transcended its origins in factual events. Captain Isabella Mendoza observed the song's social impact with professional interest. As a former Spanish noblewoman turned pirate, she understood how popular culture could influence political attitudes and military recruitment. The ballad that celebrated Pepper's heroics also recruited sympathy for the pirate cause among people who might otherwise support British rule. "Your monkey has become more valuable than a fleet of warships," she told Blackwood during their strategic conference. "Stories inspire men to acts of courage that mere gold cannot purchase." The song's verses also served practical intelligence purposes, encoding information about British naval movements and defensive preparations within seemingly innocent entertainment. Sailors' ballads had always carried news between ports, but the monkey's rescue demonstrated how musical communication could operate beneath official notice. Young Tommy Sullivan discovered his own role in the ballad's evolution, finding himself transformed into brave Tommy the Bold, whose explosive expertise rivaled that of military engineers. The boy's embarrassment at such exaggeration was balanced by pride in his crew's recognition and the respect shown by pirates throughout the harbor. The sheet music itself became a valuable commodity, copied by scribes who sold versions to ships departing for ports throughout the Caribbean and beyond. Some enterprising merchants included the ballad in cargo manifests bound for London, ensuring that news of British humiliation would reach the Empire's heart through channels that official censorship couldn't control. Pepper seemed to understand his new status as living legend, accepting tributes of fruit and rum from visiting crews with the dignity of a celebrity who recognized his responsibilities to admirers. The monkey's behavior suggested awareness that he had become something larger than himself, a symbol of defiance that inspired others to acts of courage. As night deepened over Tortuga's harbor, the song continued echoing from ship to ship, its melody carrying promises that small acts of loyalty could achieve victories that overwhelming force could not match. The treasure map spread across the tavern table bore the distinctive markings of Spanish cartographers, its parchment yellowed with age and edges burned from some long-forgotten fire. Ink marks indicated the location of a Jesuit mission's hidden gold, buried on an island off the coast of Honduras during a hasty evacuation 50 years earlier. The map represented new opportunities for the reunited crew, promising adventures that would cement their reputation while providing the resources needed for future independence. Captain Rousseau had acquired the chart through a poker game with a dying Spanish priest who had traded his order's secret for medical attention that ultimately proved insufficient to save his life. The Frenchman offered to share the treasure's location in exchange for partnership in what promised to be a lucrative but dangerous expedition. The island is uninhabited except for hostile natives who have killed every previous expedition sent to recover the gold. Rousseau explained, pointing to warning symbols scattered across the map's interior. But your recent escape has demonstrated that impossible obstacles can be overcome through clever planning and loyal crews. Blackwood studied the chart with the calculating eye of a man who had spent 15 years evaluating risk against reward. The indicated treasure was substantial enough to fund independent operations for years, but the dangers were equally substantial. Native resistance, treacherous reefs, and the possibility of Spanish naval patrols all contributed to a risk profile that would deter less experienced captains. Pepper examined the map with intense concentration, his small hands tracing the coastline features, while his intelligent eyes processed details that might escape human notice. The monkey's memory for geographical features had proven invaluable during previous treasure hunts, and his ability to spot hidden dangers often meant the difference between success and disaster. The prospect of new adventure energized the entire crew, who had grown restless during their 3 days of enforced inactivity while imprisoned or hiding in Port Royal. Tommy Sullivan practically vibrated with excitement at the thought of exploring uncharted territories, while Maria Santos began calculating the supplies and equipment that such an expedition would require. The Spanish records indicate that the mission's gold reserves included coins minted in Peru and Mexico, plus religious artifacts crafted from precious metals. Rousseau continued. Conservative estimates suggest a value exceeding 50,000 pieces of such wealth would transform them from hunted fugitives into independently wealthy adventurers capable of funding their own fleet and operation. More importantly, it would provide the resources needed to establish a secure base beyond British reach, somewhere they could operate without constant fear of capture and execution. Old Pete McKinnon had experience with hostile native populations from his naval service, and his knowledge would prove essential for any expedition attempting to penetrate defended territory. The old sailor's tactical expertise, combined with his understanding of military logistics, made him invaluable for planning complex operations in unfamiliar environments. The map also revealed why previous expeditions had failed. Spanish colonial records showed a pattern of overconfidence and poor preparation that had doomed treasure hunters who assumed superior weapons would guarantee success against determined native defenders. The indigenous warriors who protected the island possessed intimate knowledge of local terrain and climate that negated many European military advantages. Elena Vasquez contributed medical expertise that would be crucial for any expedition venturing into tropical regions, where disease killed more Europeans than enemy action. Her knowledge of herbal remedies and traditional healing methods could mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure when conventional medicine proved inadequate. The chart's age raised questions about the treasure's current status, but Rousseau's intelligence sources suggested that recent Spanish expeditions had also failed to recover the gold. If the wealth remained buried after 50 years of attempts, it likely awaited someone clever enough to succeed where others had failed. Iron Fist Morrison's enthusiasm for the proposed expedition reflected his desire to prove that their recent escape was beginning rather than climax of their adventures together. The big man's strength would be essential for any treasure recovery operation, while his loyalty provided emotional anchor for a crew still processing their dramatic rescue. Blackwood recognized that accepting Rousseau's proposal would commit them to months of dangerous sailing through waters where British patrols had been increased following their escape. But the alternative was a life of constant flight and diminishing resources that would ultimately prove unsustainable. The treasure map represented more than potential wealth. It offered purpose and direction for a crew that had been scattered and nearly destroyed by betrayal and capture. Finding the mission's gold would restore their independence while proving that their bond could overcome any obstacle the Caribbean might present. Pepper's new pirate hat sat jauntily on his small head, its tiny tricorn shape crafted with loving care by the crew during their final evening in Tortuga's harbor. Made from scraps of black felt and decorated with a miniature skull and crossbones, the hat represented acceptance, belonging, and recognition of the monkey's place in pirate lore. No longer was he simply Captain Blackwood's pet. He had earned his place as a full member of the crew through courage that exceeded that of many humans. The hat's creation had been Tommy Sullivan's idea, inspired by his observation that Pepper deserved visible recognition for his heroic actions. Maria Santos had provided the felt from her collection of tavern supplies, while old Pete McKinnon contributed his seamanship skills to ensure the hat would stay secure even in rough weather. The entire crew had participated in its decoration, each member adding some small touch that reflected their appreciation for the monkey's loyalty. As dawn broke over the Caribbean, the Crimson Tide prepared to depart Tortuga with her hull repaired, her crew rested, and her reputation enhanced beyond anything Blackwood had achieved in 15 years of piracy. The rescue from Port Royal's execution platform had transformed them from successful criminals into living legends whose story would inspire future generations of those who chose freedom over security. The impact of their escape continued to reverberate throughout the colonial Caribbean, creating ripple effects that reached far beyond their immediate circle. In Port Royal, Governor Harrington faced an investigation that would likely end his career, while Captain Mills found himself reassigned to less prestigious duties as punishment for allowing such a public humiliation of British authority. Across the Caribbean, other pirate crews had begun adopting similar rescue tactics, inspired by Pepper's example to develop their own emergency protocols for freeing captured comrades. The monkey's heroics had accidentally created a new standard for pirate loyalty that elevated expectations throughout the Brotherhood. British naval commanders found themselves forced to revise security procedures for high-value prisoners, implementing costly measures designed to prevent future escapes. The additional expense and complexity of these protocols created strain on colonial budgets while reducing the efficiency of naval operations throughout the region. The Ballad of Pepper's Rescue had reached London itself, where it circulated in coffeehouses and taverns, despite official attempts at suppression. Popular sentiment increasingly viewed pirates as romantic figures rather than dangerous criminals, a shift in attitude that complicated government efforts to maintain public support for expensive naval operations. Blackwood stood at his ship's wheel as they cleared Tortuga's harbor, feeling the familiar satisfaction of wind filling sails and bow cutting through clear water. But this departure carried emotional weight that previous voyages had lacked. The rescue had reminded him of bonds that transcended mere professional relationships, connections forged through shared danger and mutual loyalty. Pepper perched on the captain's shoulder, his new hat secured with thin leather straps that allowed it to remain in place even during acrobatic movements through the rigging. The monkey's pride in his new status was evident in his bearing, and his fellow crew members had begun consulting him on matters ranging from weather prediction to navigation. The treasure map secured in Blackwood's cabin promised adventures that would test every skill they had developed during their years together. But those future challenges seemed manageable for a crew that had successfully rescued their captain from the heart of British colonial power through planning, courage, and a monkey's unwavering loyalty. As the sun climbed higher and Tortuga's harbor disappeared behind them, the Crimson Tide sailed toward adventures that would add new chapters to Caribbean pirate lore. Behind them, they left a British colonial administration struggling to restore credibility damaged by a small monkey's determination to save his friend. The hat that crowned Pepper's small head represented more than recognition of past heroics. It symbolized the bonds that held pirate crews together through dangers that would scatter less loyal associations. In a world where betrayal and abandonment were common survival strategies, the monkey's actions had demonstrated that some relationships transcended mere convenience. Their ship's wake stretched toward the horizon like a white road leading to unlimited possibilities, while overhead, Pepper's tiny hat caught the morning breeze as he surveyed the endless Caribbean from his perch beside the most notorious pirate captain in the Spanish Main. The legend that began with a rescue would continue with adventures that proved loyalty and courage could triumph over any obstacle the world might present. The endless blue Caribbean stretched before them, promising storms and treasures, dangers and triumphs that would test the bonds forged in Port Royal's harbor during one remarkable morning when a monkey's love conquered an empire's might.